All right, now we're finally getting to the part of the course where we can get hands on the camera and start doing something with it. I know there was, lots of buttons and controls and menus and stuff, but you really had to lay the foundation to where we've gotten to now, where we can start using the camera. First thing we're going to talk about is exposure, which is really important on these DSLRs. Probably actually the most important thing is focus, because if it's out of focus, you bring it in, you really can't fix it on your computer. Where exposure, you can fix it, but it's really important to nail the exposure the best you can in camera. So let's start talking about exposure. Years ago when I bought my first, this is actually my first HD camcorder, life was good because, you'd be shooting with it. It was automatic exposure. Life was really easy. And then if you wanted to change it manually, there was a button on the touchscreen that said exposure, and you could go up or down, and life was really easy. There was no shutter speed, aperture, or ISO really to deal with. It was just one word. Because on these cameras, you will never find anywhere on there that says exposure, except for exposure compensation, which is a photography related item. But for us, we have to deal with the three things that I just mentioned. And we're going to dive into those really deep later. But basically, they form a triangle that makes up the word exposure. So you got your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. So before we start talking about exposure, we kind of have to talk about metering. And this camera on the still side comes with 4 different metering modes, but on the video side of things, we only get one, which I guess you could say is either a good thing or a bad thing. In terms of complexity, it's a good thing because we only have one to remember how to use, and that's center weighted average. All right, center weighted average. So what is that? Basically, sorry, I'm using one of my girls' dolls. Later on, we'll be using actually real live talent. What's great about this doll is she doesn't move and she doesn't complain. So for these type of tests, as we're getting started, she's great to have here. So center weighted average basically is it looks at the entire frame. And I've got these rule of thirds kind of grid on here. And basically what center weighted average is, it looks at this center area right here. It's weighting it more heavily on what's going on in that in terms of brightness. Although it's still looking at the entire frame, it's very different than something like spot metering, because spot metering looks at like just a tiny dot, like where I've got this, this little piece of this right here in the center is pretty much the only thing it looks like in the center. And that's great for doing like really heavily backlit subjects in photography. But again, we only got one metering mode, and that is center weighted average. This is all we've got to deal with. So this indicator down here is called our exposure level indicator, and this little tick mark below here, right in the center, so goes to +3 or -3 stops range. And this saying it in the little tick mark right in the center means that we have what it considers to be a properly exposed image. And what it's basing it off of is what's called 18% gray, and that's what this is right here, and it's the same as that over there. And it's just a level of brightness that the camera wants to see. A camera is pretty much dumb. It doesn't know that there's a doll in the frame and what to expose it to. It's just saying, I see the gray and I'm telling you that looks like it's about right. So we're going to go through a lot of different methods to set up exposure. I'm showing you this is just one of the methods. And the important part I want to tell you right now is, don't get in the trap of saying, oh, it's right in the middle, I'm good, it's perfect. Watch this. If I reposition her and I put her in kind of the rule of thirds kind of thing, where she's over on this side, look what happened to the meter. All of a sudden, now it says I'm 1 1/3 stop overexposed, but yet on her face, it doesn't look too bad. So we're at an aperture of 7.1. If I were to take that aperture and increase it all the way to f11, all of a sudden on her face looks very dark. Here, I hit record. So her face is very dark, and I would call that too much underexposed. It's way underexposed. But if I bring it back to f11, or sorry, f7.1, now her face looks a lot better. All right, so the big concept here is don't rely on this exposure level indicator all the time. We're going to show you a lot of different tools coming up. All right, before we start talking about shutter speed, I want to talk about exposure, how important it is. you have to really nail the exposure. You could be maybe a third of a stop under, a third of a stop over the exposure that you want. That'll be pretty close, but if you start getting a stop over or under, then things start being nasty and really hard to fix in post. So let me demonstrate this. Here I am down in my studio. It's kind of a high contrast shot, which I wanted to try just one light. And what I did is I used a digital calibration target, which has 18% gray, and I put that 18% gray right in the middle of the histogram. And then what I've got here is on the left-hand side, I've got evenly exposed on the left, and I've got one stop underexposed on the right. Now you'll notice on the right, the skin starts getting this kind of reddish tint to it, and it has almost looks a little bit sunburned sometimes when you underexpose. Now if I go 2/3 of a stop underexposed, it's starting to look a little bit better, but it still doesn't look quite right. And then a third of a stop actually looks very good. I could have used the third of a stop down. In fact, a lot of the times what I'll do, if the even exposure looks too bright, I'll actually back it down a third of a stop. And I'll show you why here in a second. Now when we go third of a stop overexposed, we start losing not skin texture, but the skin tone itself actually starts going away. It's looking more white. Here's 2/3 of a stop, and when we have a full stop, which is way too bright. Now what happens here is, let's say you've gone out and you've shot something overexposed, especially when it comes to a person or a skin tone. When you go to try to recover it, here what I've done is I used the waveform and I've matched the two as best I could. And they matched that actually quite well in terms of levels. But what you'll notice here is my skin tone is now less saturated on the right-hand side. And also, by bringing up some of these levels, I have introduced noise into the black background as well. Stepping to 2/3 of a stop, it's starting to look better, but not as saturated in the skin tones. And then we've got a third of a stop, is looking pretty darn good actually. So if you're like a third of a stop above or a third of a stop below, it works pretty well. Now we'll go to 2/3 of a stop over. Now the skin is kind of taking on this, how do I describe it? Here, let me show you one stop overexposed. One stop, trying to fix that is really hard. I can't tell you how many times I've done it myself where I've been outside just filming myself and the clouds are in when I started recording, and then all of a sudden the clouds went away and the sun's shining directly on my face, and I'm like at least a stop over exposed, and then trying to fix it in post. You get this kind of effect, and I don't know what the term is, but when you try to correct it, you get this kind of like a terracotta color, like a pot that you put plants into has that kind of terracotta color and texture. And that's kind of what happens to your skin, is when you're way overexposed and you try to bring it down, you get that kind of look. So again, I just want to talk about the importance of exposure. And if you're going to be, my rule of thumb is, try to nail it as best you can. If you're a third of a stop below, I think you're totally fine, but try to get as best you can, and it'll make your images look so much better. All right, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture are all related. They kind of form a triangle in terms of exposure. All I want you to know for right now is they are related, and I'm going to demonstrate how they're related later on. So first up is shutter speed, and I think shutter speed is probably the easiest one to start with because it's almost a set and forget type thing. I'd say the majority of the time I'm shooting at a 50th of a second. Sometimes I shoot at a 60th of a second. Sometimes I shoot at 125th of a second. Sometimes I even shoot higher than that with shutter speed. And I'll explain where I got those numbers later. All right, so let's talk about where I came up with the numbers 50th of a second, 60th of a second, and 125th of a second. Those are the ones I most commonly use. Before we talk about, we got to talk about frame rates. So movies, 24 frames per second, video, TV, broadcast, 30 frames per second for the most part. So I myself personally shoot at 24 frames per second, and the main reason I do, I kind of like the film look, but really when it comes down to it is when you're publishing to the web like I do, almost exclusively. In fact, I've never had anything on TV that have been broadcast that I know of. But basically what happens is when you upload to YouTube, Vimeo, Blip TV, all of them, no matter what frame rate you shot it in and then you put it into your timeline, let's say it was 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, they're all going to retranscode it. They're all going to reconform it basically down to 24 frames. Because for them, it's much easier to do that. It's less computer intensive, and for your smartphone, your computer, 24 frames a second, it's easier to do on the web than 30 frames per second. So step one in terms of picking my shutter speed is I pick my frames per second. So if I'm shooting at, let's say 1080, 24 frames per second, I'm going to double it. So that's 48th of a second shutter speed. There is no 48th shutter speed on the Canon cameras, so I picked the next best thing, which is 50th of a second. So why double the frame rate to get the shutter speed? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to how cameras used to work, and they used to use their rotary shutter. And to demonstrate this, I'll show you this little thing I created. And basically the square rectangle is your frame, and the CD that I've got is the rotary shutter. So as you see, as I rotate the rotary shutter, that half the time the frame is exposed and half the time it's not. And there's a term for this, and it's called the 180-degree shutter rule. And basically, when you look at a circle, it's 360 degrees, and if you chop it in half, you get 180 degrees. And that's what's happening, is half the time the frame is exposed and half the time it's not. So if we do a little math and we take 1/24 and we divide by 2, we get 1/48th, or in our case, the Canon cameras, 1/50th of a second shutter speed. All right, so what does a shutter speed of 1/50th look like for your videos? So let me demonstrate. Here I am golfing in my backyard, and you'll notice when I swing and then I freeze the frame, you can't see the golf club at all. It's totally gone. But then when I take it and then I increase the shutter speed from 50th of a second to 1,000th of a second and I stop it, you can see now that you can actually see the golf club. And then just to demonstrate on slow motion, where I shot this at 60 frames per second and I slowed it down to 24 frames per second in my timeline, you can see that the amount of blur on the golf club is the same as when I shot it at a 50th of a second. So I'm using the same 180-degree shutter rule for the slow motion as I am for the regular speed. So I don't always shoot at 50th of a second or always follow the 180-degree rule. There's sometimes when I do some action, it's pretty rare, but if I have an action scene, because I don't do that much action, I will film at maybe 2/50th or 500 to give that more staccato, choppy look, technical look, and it adds, especially in a chase scene or something like that, it adds a lot of more edginess to it, and it helps your viewer feel like they're actually in the action. Another reason I will change the shutter speed is when I'm in, let's say, an environment with a lot of fluorescent lights, or maybe some even cheaper LED lights, when you start getting what's called banding. And so what I'll do is I'll actually play with the shutter speed, because some of those are based off the frequency. So I'll actually, instead of shooting at a 50th of a second, I might go down to a 30th or try a 40th. I might go up to a 60th, an 80th. I'll play around with it until I find where that banding kind of goes away and it's not present with those cheaper fluorescent lights. Okay, shutter speed as it pertains to exposure. As you can see here, I'm starting out at a 50th of a second and I'm working my way up in terms of shutter speed. I'm going up to like 2,000ths or 4,000ths of a second, and it makes it a lot darker. On the reverse side, if you go from a 50th and you go down, you can do a 40th and you can do a 30th. So it gives you a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop more light. So if you're in a situation where you're like this, and the person, let's say, doesn't talk with their hands much and waving their arms around, and it's basically just a talking head like this, go down to a 30th of a second. If you need more light, let's say your lens won't let you go farther. Let's say it goes only down to 5.6 and you need just 2 more thirds of stop of light. Go down to a 30th of a second. Not a problem, because you're not going to see much difference in terms of motion blur of the person talking like I am. So the other thing I want to talk about is there's really no right or wrong shutter speed. And it just, use whatever you want, play around with it, and you'll get an understanding. Sure, a 50th of a second or using the 180-degree rule will get you close, get you started, because even if we were to follow the rule, we should be at a 48th of a second. We're going to a 50th of a second. So play around with it, have some fun. A great exercise for you guys to do is go out to like a water fountain and just turn it on, and as the water arcs, shoot it at like a 50th of a second, and also shoot it at a high shutter speed and see what happens. Or water passing by in a river. Just try a lot of different examples and you'll get an idea of what that shutter is doing to your image and how it makes you feel when you watch it. So that's pretty much it for shutter speed. All right, really quickly, I want to talk about slow motion in the post-production workflow. Again, we're really not talking about computers and nonlinear editors in this course because it goes well beyond the scope of this course, but really quick, I want to tell you, when we're shooting for slow motion, we're shooting at 60 frames per second, which is 720p, and you let's say you've increased your shutter to 1/25th of a second to get that nice consistent motion blur. Basically what we do is we've taken 60 frames, and we don't need all 60 frames per second. You could do it in 24 frames per second, but we've got all these extra frames in there, and what we can do with it is when we put it on the timeline, we can then take it and stretch it out. So you're going from 60 frames and you're stretching it all the way to 24 frames on the 24 frame timeline. So basically when you're doing that is you're getting silky smooth slow motion. Because if you do try to do the same thing, you put a clip on the timeline that's shot at 24 frames a second, like 1080, and then you try to almost double the length of the clip like you do with the 60 frames per second, you're going to get really choppy, kind of not very fluid slow motion. But when you put the 60 frames per second on the timeline, you won't, kind of double it. You're going to get this very fluid slow motion. So again, I don't really want to show you how to do it because it goes well beyond the scope of this course, but I know I keep talking about slow motion because I just wanted to tell you, basically bring it on the timeline and then do the calculations to go from 60 frames down to 24. A lot of times you don't even have to do the calculation. If you're in Premiere Pro, you just say reinterpret the footage from 60 down to 23.976, 23.976, and it'll give you that beautiful slow motion. ISO. So what is ISO? ISO is a measurement of your camera's sensitivity to light. All right, sounds really technical. So what exactly does that all mean? Think of it this way. Y'all have probably access to a stereo system. If you were to play music and then you turn the volume all the way down while the music's playing, you put your ear up to the speaker, you're not going to hear anything. You turn up the volume, it gets louder. You put your ear up to it, definitely gets louder. But the same thing applies with your camera's sensor. As you apply more ISO, the higher the number goes, the more bright your image becomes. And just as with music, as if you were to play music, turn the volume up and hit pause the music and put your ear up to the speaker, you're going to be able to hear a whole bunch of background hiss and noise, depending how good your amplifier is. And the same thing applies with your camera's sensor. The higher you go with the ISO number, let's say 6400 for instance, you look at the image, you're going to start to notice more and more noise creep into your image. All right, of the 3 elements that make up exposure, ISO is one that can degrade your image. It changes the exposure, and it doesn't really give you anything creatively, unless you like noise as a creative element. But shutter speed, as we talked about earlier, can give you a certain look in terms of motion blur. And f-stop, or aperture, we're going to be talking about next, that one will definitely give you a different look as you raise or lower the number, and it also changes the exposure. So ISO, really have to pay attention to it. If you don't like the look of grain or noise, Definitely you want to shoot with a lot of things in mind, from contrast to lighting. A lot of stuff we're going to be talking about here in a second. All right, next step we're going to do is do the old lens cap test. So I'm just going to put the lens cap on the lens. I'm going to run through all the different ISOs. So what I've done already is, on the far right, we got ISO 100, which is our cleanest ISO. And then what we're going to do is move our way over, and as we can see all the way on the left at 25,600, which is just insane what you can shoot at. We're definitely getting some noise. And sometimes if you're watching this on a mobile device, again, you're probably not going to see this, and sometimes on your monitor, what you have to do is just kind of look around left or right to actually see the noise. Sometimes you have to be a little bit off axis to really see a lot of the noise. So just to keep in mind exactly what the noise looks like at a high ISO. So just how far can you push this full frame camera? And you can actually push it a lot. 1600, no problem. You might see a little bit of noise. 3200, I've definitely gone there. And in some instances, I've gone as high as 6400 when I've really needed to. Beyond that, I really don't go higher than that, because then you do really start getting into noise. Unless you really have to get the shot, then you can definitely go and push it as far as you like. But typically, and it depends on what you're viewing it on, because if the audience is only viewing it on, like, let's say an iPhone, go ahead and push it as hard as you want, because by the time it gets, downscaled all the way to that iPhone device, the amount of pixelation and noise that you're going to see is going to be pretty minimal. All right, let me give you a few guidelines of where to set your ISO. If you're outside, bright sunny day, ISO 100. Let's say if it's cloudy and maybe you're under a tree or something like that, maybe ISO 200. As let's say you move indoors and you have a lot of natural light coming in, you might be going to ISO 400. It all depends, because the relationship between the shutter speed, if you're keeping your shutter speed at like 50th a second and you're shooting for 1080, that's fine, and it depends where your f-stop is. If you need a lot of depth of field, not shallow depth of field, but you need, like, your actor or actress or your talent is moving a lot, and you need to be shooting at like f8, then obviously you're going to need to pump up your ISO. But as you get into situations where, let's say, there's no natural light coming in from outside and you're just using the light in the room, it depends on the light. I mean, I've got some pretty bright lights here that are actually supplementing from what's coming in outside. But in most cases, you might be ISO 800, you might be 1250, maybe 1600. For the most part, I've found in certain lighting situations, if I light really well, I usually don't have to go above 1600. When you get to 3200 and 6400, you're in situations where you can't control the light. Let's say you're in a gymnasium, and you're shooting for slow motion, so you got your shutter speed at 125th of a second, then you're going to need to pump your ISO quite a bit. All right, next up I want to show you two different shots. Which one do you think is shot at a higher ISO, the one on the left or the one on the right? Well, to be honest, they're both shot at the exact same ISO, 25,600. And I usually don't shoot at this high of an ISO. I usually don't go above 6,400. But in this case, I want to show it because you can see it a lot better. So what's the difference between the two? They're lit differently. There's different lighting. One has high contrast and the one has lower contrast. Before you start thinking, all right, I better not shoot low contrast, I better shoot everything high contrast. Well, it's not that. What I want to show you is, look at the one on the right, and I'm going to draw an oval around that area between the very dark and the very light. There's not much living in that kind of that gradient going between light and dark. And if we look at a waveform monitor, I know this is kind of an advanced topic, but if you look at a waveform monitor in your nonlinear editor, that noise usually resides between 20 and 30 IRE. So what we want to do is we want to light our scene in such a way where we don't have many pixels in that 20 to 30 IRE. Well, we don't have, a waveform monitor, unfortunately, on these Canon cameras, but what we can do is I can kind of give you a guideline in terms of what that looks like in your histogram, because your histogram, again, shows you brightness left to right and the amount of pixels up and down. So if you have a lot of pixels living in this region, and let me show you on this histogram right here, you want to stay away from this where I'm putting this oval right here. If you have a lot of pixels living in that area, then you're going to run into very noisy situations running at, like, let's say 6400. So an example would be, let's say you're doing an interview and the person's sitting in a chair like I am. And let's say the back wall, which in this case it's not, because I have this lit by the windows, a lot of lights coming in from that window. Let's say that back wall was living between that 20 to 30 IRE, or on the histogram, it's in that kind of area. And you're shooting at a very high ISO for some reason. Let's say you don't have good enough lights, or the person's moving around a lot, and you're shooting at a very high f-stop, and you're shooting at, let's say, 6400. Well, that wall is going to be very noisy, but what you can do is, if you have, a little LED light, and sometimes the little tiny ones, they're about that big, they're not that much money, 40 or 50 bucks, and you can just, has a rotary switch or rotary knob on it, you can just gently increase it, and then watch your histogram and watch all those pixels, the amount of pixels in that area kind of go away. And then if you need to shoot at that really high, ISO, you can. So what it comes down to is, you got to learn how to light, and you got to learn the weakness of your camera. In our case, with these Canon cameras, these full frame cameras, it's usually between 20 and 30 IRE. You just kind of have to watch out for that. All right, just to reinforce this, I want to show you an example down in my studio. This first shot is where I'm down in the studio. I'm only being lit by two soft boxes in front of me. And I've done it in such a way where I've distanced myself away from the wall. That wall is actually a white bed sheet. And the light is falling off enough to where it's turning this very dark gray. And it's running into that 20, and actually I've lit it so it's living in that 20 to 30 IRE range. And you can see it's incredibly noisy. Now, the next shot, I did not change the lighting at all. I changed the white bed sheet out for a totally black bed sheet. And look at the difference. If you look at the two between the dark one and the grayish kind of background, they look night and day in terms of noise, don't they? The black background looks cleaner. Now we could take this to another extreme. Let's say you didn't want a black background, but you wanted to use a white one. Well, here's the white one. Again, all I did here now is I didn't relight myself. All I did was I lit the white bed sheet so it was a lot brighter. So again, just another example is, learning the weakness of your camera. In this case, don't want to shoot around 20 or 30 IRE, or in your case, if you don't want to know about waveform monitors, your histogram, you just kind of want to stay away from this area on your histogram. And if you do that and you learn how to light really well, you can push these full frame cameras amazing to like 6400 and shoot quite cleanly. All right, before we move on to Aperture, let's recap. Shutter speed does basically two things. You've got exposure control, and you got somewhat of a creative control when it comes to how much motion blur you want, in terms of how you want a lot of motion blur or very little motion blur. ISO basically does only one thing, and that would be exposure control. It does have the extra added feature of noise, which you kind of want to stay away from unless that's the kind of look you want to go for. And then Aperture does two things as well. It basically does exposure control, and probably the most important, to me anyway, the most creative thing that you get out of these type of DSLR cameras is the shallow depth of field. This shot, for instance, is shot at 1.8, and you can see it has a very pleasing bokeh. Basically, bokeh is how items look out of focus, and these circles that you see are basic, and you've seen it just probably in about every movie, are basically Christmas lights way out of focus, and they create this very large circle. And it's not just for Christmas lights, it's other things. It's how when you're shooting somebody with trees in the background, for instance, and light maybe streaming through it, and you put the trees way out of focus, and you just focus on the person that you're interviewing that's very close to you, those trees with that light coming through can create a very pleasing bokeh as well. It's not just Christmas lights. Then if we compare it to what it looks like at 5.6, you can see that the bokeh, or the size of the Christmas lights, have gone down dramatically in terms of how out of focus they are, because now the depth of field is increasing. We don't have a very shallow depth of field, we have a very long or large depth of field. I don't even really like the term depth of field. I think it's very confusing for people that are beginning. I know when I first started, it was like depth of field. What? I would call it depth of focus, and I think other people have called it depth of focus. Now, if you look at this shot, this is a really good example. This is just basically a texture, a carpet, and this is a great exercise for you guys to do to learn how shallow, open up your lens wide open. And that's a term we can talk about really quickly. A lot of people are going to say wide open. And when you're shooting wide open, that means that the blades, the aperture is wide as it can be. And basically, to define aperture, if you don't know by now, is basically how much light is allowed into the lens. And it's restricted by those blades, or it can be unrestricted by just bringing it wide open. Another couple terms really quick, people are going to refer to fast glass. Typically, if you have a cheaper zoom, it's not really considered fast glass because it's a very slow lens. It can only go to, let's say, 5.6 if you zoom all the way out. Another term is stopping down. When people say stopping down, they refer to taking those blades and restricting them down. That's called stopping down. And then wide open, again, is opening that aperture all the way up. So it can be very confusing when you're first starting. You think, well, I've got an f/22 and I've got a f/1.8. You know, isn't the 22 wide open? No, it's not. That's backwards. And that's the way I kind of thought when I first picked up my camera. It's kind of counterintuitive. The best way I can describe it to you, but maybe that you can remember it, is think of a swimming pool. I listened to a podcast with Sil Arena, and he gave this analogy, and I think it's really quite good. Basically, if you look at a swimming pool and you think of the shallow end as your, let's say, your 1.8 or 2.8 that your lens can do, and then you look at the deep end, which is like an f/22, let's say, the deep end has a lot of water in it. So the amount of things that are in focus, the depth of the pool is very large. Whereas you go to the very shallow end, let's say it's one of those really, those pools that have a gradual grade. At the very end, you have a very just a little bit of water. Well, that is it's your 1.8 or 2.8. It's very shallow. So that might be a way for you guys to remember it. Sometimes I get lots of questions like, Dave, what aperture did you shoot that at? Or what did you do here? Or what did you do there? Kind of thing. And I want to tell you there's really no right or wrong aperture. It's just like shutter speed. There's no right or wrong. Whatever looks good to you. So basically, if you're trying to separate somebody from the background and you want to concentrate if that part of the story or whatever you're doing, maybe you're doing an interview and you want that person to just know what that person's talking about. And you want to take all the distractions away from the background, basically. A great thing to do is shoot at a very narrow depth of field, shallow depth of field. Maybe like a 3.2, maybe even a 2.8 if the person's not moving much. Right now, I am filming myself at 3.2 because I know personally I'm not going to move much in this chair. If you're interviewing somebody that moves around a lot, I would suggest bumping that up maybe to a 5.6. A great way to do this is the punch-in tool that we talked about earlier. So basically when you've got the person's doing an interview, tell them to move around, lean in, lean out as much as they're going to do in the interview. So they might say, well, I might lean forward a little bit to make my point, and I might lean back to be more, think about something. And then when they do that, make sure that punch in and look right at their eye, and make sure that it's in focus there. And then when they lean in, and then they maybe take their glasses off and they make a dramatic point, that when they lean in a little bit, that their eye is also in focus. And that might be 5.6. That's a great place to start. For me, I know just from years of doing this, I don't move that much in my chair, and I could easily go down to 2.8 and I'll still, and I focus right on one of my eyes, usually the eye that's closest to the camera. Because once you get to like 1.8, which I wouldn't recommend doing that, that's just way too, or 1.4 or 1.2, that becomes so narrow. Just the distance between your eyelash and your, the reflective part of your eye, those two things can be different in terms of focus. It's wafer thin. It's not waffle thin. It's like wafer thin. As you can see here by moving up and down the carpet, zoomed in, we could see that the tape measure It doesn't take much. You just move that focus ring a little bit and it changes the focus dramatically. So you can be quite out of focus just by tapping your lens at 1.4. All right, pretty much we've been talking about this lens. It's the 50mm 1.8. I love it. It's cheap. If you're really low on cash and you haven't bought one yet, go pick one up. Awesome lens. Beautiful bokeh, super sharp. Has a little bit of vignetting when you're shooting wide open, but not too bad. So there's a 1.4 version of this. It's a lot more. It's like 3 times more expensive. The big benefit of that one, it has a larger focus ring. So if you're pulling focus a lot, definitely get that lens and if you got the cash. All right, so we've been talking about primes. This is a prime, meaning it's not a zoom. So we need to now go to another type of lens, and that is the zoom. This is a very large zoom. And when you get large and expensive glass, usually means one thing, that it's constant or fixed aperture throughout the entire zoom range on the minimum number. And when we say minimum, that's the lowest aperture, how wide open it is. This one is at 2.8, so I can zoom from 70 all the way to 200 at 2.8 and nothing will happen to the blades inside of for the aperture, which is wonderful. The downside is it's heavier and it's a lot more expensive. Now, if you're going with a cheaper, this is a much cheaper lens. It's a zoom lens. It's the 28 to 135. It's a great all-around lens, a great travel lens. I've used it a ton. It's fairly sharp, and it has really good image stabilization, which I like. But the problem with this, and especially for beginners, is what happens is the thing that kind of trips you up a little bit is when you're at 28 or even to about 35, I think it happens, you can shoot at this minimum aperture, which is 3.5. And then, because it'll be written on the lens what the range is. And then if I can find the label real quick. Oh, it's right here. So it's 3.5 to 5.6, meaning that you're going to get a difference. It's not constant, it's not fixed aperture. So when I zoom from all the way to 28 to 135, what's going to happen is when I start out at 28, it'll be 3.5, but by the time I get to 135, it'll have stopped down. The blades will have gotten constricted to 5.6. And you can see that here in this demonstration with the gray card. As I zoom in, you'll see that it gets darker. So one of the things you could just say to yourself is, well, I really shouldn't be zooming while I'm filming. I should just stop recording, reposition, and get the next shot. Typically, I don't ever zoom. It's very rare that I zoom while I'm filming. All right, just a few recommendations to get you started. When you're going outside and it's a bright sunny day and you're shooting at a 50th of a second in ISO 100, you're typically going to be around, at least in Colorado, you're going to be around f/16. It's a great place to start. If you want to go down from there and it's a really sunny day, you're going to need to put an ND filter on it. And again, we're not really talking about extra accessories here, but if you want to be shooting at like a 3.5 on a bright sunny day, you're going to need to screw on an ND filter or some sort of sunglasses, basically, for your lens, so you can basically open up the lens at a wider aperture. All right, and then when you move inside, a great place to start, depending on your lighting situation, obviously, but you're going to be like maybe at a 5.6 is a great place to start, and your ISO might be at ISO 400. If it gets really dimly lit, maybe you're going down to 2.8 if your lens can actually do that. So the depth of field is also related to a couple other things, how much you're zooming and the distance. For instance, and how, because if you're shooting at a very wide angle lens, let's say, for instance, like the GoPro, I have a GoPro and I was shooting a time lapse and it was super wide and it was super sunny. And the darn thing was shooting at f2.8 and everything was in focus. Why? Because I was shooting at such a wide angle lens. And if I'm shooting at 24 on a full frame camera, which is much wider than, we talked about on a crop sensor camera, again, a lot of things are going to be in focus past 5 or 6 feet from the camera. So if you're shooting at, let's say, 1.4 and it's very dimly lit, but your subject, let's say, is, let's say, 50 feet away, well, they can move in and out of focus. It's going to take them a bit. But if they're like 2 feet from the camera, let's say this particular lens, I can go as close as 1.5 feet. So if I have my subject 1.5 feet away from this camera, if they move just a few millimeters, they're going to be out of focus. It doesn't take much at all. So it's dependent on your distance. So again, if let's say you're doing an interview and the person's, let's say, typically 8 feet away from the camera, or I'm right here, I'm about maybe 5 feet from the camera, but let's say they're about 7 feet from the camera, they can move a little bit, and depending on how much you're zoomed and what your f-stop is. So it's something that you're going to just have to play with. I just can't give you all the scenarios because there's too many. There's too many variables. The zoom, the distance, and your f-stop. All right, next up, we're going to talk about the histogram. It's a really powerful tool. There's another tool that's probably more powerful, and that's a waveform monitor. We don't have that in this camera. Usually when you get the cameras like at 10, 15 grand, you start getting into that. The 5D Mark III does not have it, unfortunately, unless you get Magic Lantern, and then you can get waveforms. But what comes stock with the camera is just the histogram. It's one of our most powerful tools. And when I first, started looking at it, I had no idea what it did, and I could never find a good explanation of how it worked. So what I'm going to do is demonstrate it to you the best way I can, and I think this will really make sense because I think this is the best way to explain what the histogram does. So I'm shooting a digital calibration target right now, and if you don't see the histogram, just press the info button once and twice and 3 times, and then you should see it. And let's put this to F8. Okay. So now what we see is 3 discrete spikes in this histogram. This graph, basically. So basically what the horizontal axis is brightness. So all the way to the far left is black. All the way to the far right is white. Best way to demonstrate that is with this digital calibration target where we've got a black, gray, and white. So I'm going to turn this towards the blacks, and what you'll notice what happened is now we just have black and gray, and all we see is 2 spikes. Just black and gray. Now if I turn it to the right, all we've got is 2 spikes, the gray spike and the white spike. So when I move the camera around, you can just see what's happening. And if I zoom in, I'm actually push in all the way to gray. And now you can see that I'm just filling the gray and there's just one big spike. And you're going to see it kind of rolls off a little bit, and that's because this light that I've got right here is coming in at a gradient, and actually the camera's causing a shadow too because I'm so close to this. I'm going to rotate all the way to black to fill it, and you can see that big black spike, and let's do it for the white, and you see a big white spike. So just to review, white's on the right, black's on the left, and right in the middle, that's your 18% gray. So the next thing we want to talk about is the vertical axis, and that's our number of pixels. So coming from an audio background, you might be looking at this, because I came from an audio background, and you're like, man, there's clipping going on in the grays, the 18% gray. And there's some clipping going on the whites. Dave, you need to fix that. It's like, no, all that is just a representation of how many pixels are there. So like if I keep moving this in towards the gray, there's more and more pixels going on in the gray area. If I move it back and I actually, let's say, zoom out, you're actually going to see the number of pixels in the center fall. And sure enough, they fell because I'm zooming out. So there's less pixels on the screen. So don't worry if it's totally reached the top. It's not clipping. But I will show you how it does clip. So what you want to think of is if you're coming from an audio background like myself, where you see the waveform getting clipped at the top, well, take that mindset and rotate it 90 degrees. So instead of worrying about the top, now we've rotated, and what we need to worry about is what's on the right. Kind of on what's to the left, but mostly what's on the right. And let me demonstrate. So what I'm going to do now, let's zoom in a little bit. So I've got the gray and the whites. And I'm going to go from, right now I'm at F8, and I'm going to move it to 7.1. You see it got brighter, everything kind of shifted. I'm going to do it again, and it shifted a little bit more. And if I do it once more at 5.6, boom, now we're clipping. This is where you need to worry about it, is when on the right-hand side, not the top, but the right-hand side, we have lost detail we're clipping in the highlights. So that's how you read the histogram. Black's on the left, gray in the middle, gray 18% gray right in the middle, and white is on the right hand side. And then what you got going up and down is just the quantity. All right, an important concept to know is that contrast and picture styles can actually affect your exposure. And best way to do it is just demonstrate it for you. So if you've forgotten where the picture style button is, I want you to press it right below the menu button and you'll see that come up. And it says right now we're in the neutral picture style. And if I use the jog wheel, you're gonna see the sharpness is all the way down, the contrast is all the way down. That's the one I really want to talk about most, is I've got the contrast turned all the way down on the neutral picture style. So we're gonna hit the picture style button again to get out of there. And what I'm gonna do now, you can see we're at f5.0, is I'm going to bring this up to f4.5 right here. I'm gonna hit record, and I'm gonna hit stop. And as you remember before, I'm gonna hit play. Before I enabled the highlight alert or the blinkies. And then what we've just hit play right here, and we can see that nothing's blinking. So nothing is, we're good, nothing's clipping. So now I'm gonna go back to just hit the record button again. It'll send us back to the movie mode. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna hit the picture style button again, but this time I'm going to use the main dial and go over to the standard picture style and press the set button. So now, yeah, and you can see it on the screen, there's an S instead of an N on the screen there. And now you can see, you look at the histogram, you see, oh man, it's awfully really close to the clipping. Because it's expanded, because we've increased the contrast, because I haven't done anything with the standard picture style, so it's got more contrast built in. It's on its default contrast setting. So what I'm gonna do is hit record and just stop. We just need a second. And then we're gonna hit the play button. And then bam, we got some flashing black blinkies. And that means that all that information right there has no detail, it's clipping, it's totally gone. So the blinkies is a great tool for showing you where in the image it's clipping. And the histogram's great too, but the histogram didn't give us the full story. When you were looking at it, you're like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's hard to tell if it's gone off the graph. But the blinkies will definitely tell you if you've gone too far. All right, it's really important to nail the exposure. We're not shooting raw here, and you can't like shift the histogram over to the right and shoot to the right and get as much information you can and then later manipulate in post. You know, with H.264 is very similar to JPEG. We don't have as much flexibility. So what we want to do is get the exposure as close as we can. Using a digital calibration target, and I know you're probably thinking, Dave, I'm a run and gun shooter. I can't use that all the time. That's true. And we're going to show you some other methods when you don't have access. But if you're setting up lights and you've got the time, it's a studio situation and you've got a few minutes extra, go ahead and grab the target, put it up, clamp it on a light stand or whatever you need to do. And you can kill two birds with one stone. One, you can get the exposure, and also you can get a custom white balance out of it. And so you're ready to go. A lot of situations you might not be able to. I mean, you can, this fits into my camera bag just fine. And when you're walking around, you can put this in your pocket. It works great. So what we're looking for is basically a gray spike. And you don't need to fill the frame with it. And let me demonstrate, because if right now the light meter is actually fluctuating back and forth, but it's pretty much, you can see the light meter at the bottom where that tick mark is, it says that we've got a properly exposed image. If I move the camera in, you're going to notice what happens. There's going to be a shadow starts to appear on the gray. Well, that's the actual camera. In a lot of situations, your body will get in front of the light. And that light, you can see, I got the light right here. It's very close because I'm trying to light up the screen. The light, you don't want to block the light that you're trying to meter. So you don't want to get too far into the scene where all the lights are. So you might be thinking, well, if I don't fill the frame, how do I know I've got it properly exposed? Well, that's where you look for the discrete spikes. And in this case, we've pulled back and we're not shadowing it any. And right now, if you look at the histogram, you can see it, that middle gray spike is right in the middle, which is perfect. But if you look at the meter, Now that we've entered more white into it, in fact, if I zoom all the way out, you'll see what happens to the meter. Now it says we're one stop too bright. Well, I wouldn't go by that. I would go by, what the spike says. So what you want to do is look for that spike, a nice, discrete, clean spike, and that's what you should really be setting your exposure to. Not the white spike, not the black spike, but right in the middle. So a really good thing for practicing, and if you're out doing, let's say you're shooting an interview and then you got to shoot some B-roll after that. B-roll is just, clips that help support what they're saying. It may be close-ups, or if they're talking about a refinery, you're going out and shooting pictures of the refinery. Or if the CEO says something about, that particular gate and fence, you go out and shoot the fence, right? Well, those are easy subjects to get. And one of the things I can recommend for you guys is to go ahead and shoot it. If you don't have a gray card, that's fine. Shoot it like where you think it should be. Shoot it a third of a stop too low and a third of a shot too bright. And then bring it into your nonlinear editor, and then you can choose. Because usually those B-roll clips are like maybe 7-10 seconds each. So keep doing that. And over the years, you'll get to know your screen, your camera, the lens that you're using really well, and you'll know your eye will get better. You're like, well, I always keep picking the minus 1/3 clip for some reason. The other ones are too bright, for instance. And you'll just get better at it after a while, especially when you just don't have access to a digital calibration target all the time. You can't put it into the scene. Next thing I want to talk about is constant aperture versus non-constant aperture glass. And we've kind of talked about this already, but this particular lens is constant aperture. It's f2.8. So if I were to go wide open right now, which we probably do, let's see if we can do this. We're gonna go all the way down to ISO 100. And I am going to take, instead of f8, I'm gonna go all the way to 2.8. Yeah, we can do this. In fact, let's bring up the ISO maybe 1-2 more clicks. And maybe bring it down 1 click. All right, so right there, I would call that a pretty good image, because I've got that gray spike. Let's move it. Actually, let's bring it up to 160. I bet you that's where it is. Yeah, 160. That's how I would kind of do it. But the point I want to talk about with constant aperture is when I zoom in and zoom out at f2.8, nothing's happening. If this was a cheaper lens, like you might have the 28 to 135, and if I were to be doing this right now, it would be changing from 3.5 to 0.6 as I'm zooming in and out. So when you're setting exposure on a constant aperture lens, you can zoom in and out, and you can look at that histogram. But when you're using a non-constant aperture lens, be very careful, because once you zoom in, it might go from 3.5 when you zoom in, goes to 5.6, and you might be getting misled because you might zoom back out again to 3.5, and then you've just ruined your exposure that you were trying to set. I want to reinforce an idea here that it's really important to get as much information into the camera as you can. And we're going to be doing that like with a neutral picture style and with the contrast turned all the way down. And you can see with the black and white spikes on the histogram, they've come closer together versus if we go to a standard picture style with a much higher contrast, you can see that those spikes have gone out farther. So they have much more contrast. So what we want to do is we want to shoot with a neutral picture style with the contrast turned all the way down. On photography side of things, when you take pictures with standard or landscape, those type of pictures, and they got a lot of contrast built into them, the pictures look fine. But when it comes to video, the lower the contrast, the better in this situation. And you might be thinking, Dave, I don't have time in post to like add contrast in. Sometimes I just want to run a gun and I want pretty pictures to come out on the computer and I don't want to do much post-processing. But believe me, by lowering the contrast to a -4 with the neutral picture style, in just about every situation, you will not have to touch the image. It'll just look great. This is very different than photography. The videos just look much better with the lower contrast. So the concept is, like the black and white spikes on the histogram, we're pushing them in on the histogram. And then later on in post, we then pull them out if we need to. Most of the time we don't. if you go to, this is more of an advanced topic, but if you shoot in a log mode on some of the more expensive cameras, they create even more of a it's almost like a really washed out image. It has hardly any contrast at all, and you definitely have to build it back in post. But the concept here I want to tell you guys is you can, basically squeeze it in and then extract it out, because later on, if you've shot in a standard picture style with a high contrast setting and it's already out, and you try to then change the contrast to be less contrasty, it's almost impossible, because if you already crushed the blacks and if you've already blown out the whites, you can't get that information back. So you want to protect the information. And like I said before, I'd say 95, maybe 90% of the time, you won't have to touch the image that much in post with these settings that I've got. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to put it all together in terms of the relationships of the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Because there are a lot of instances where you're going to say, I need another stop of light. How do I get it? Where do I get it from? It'll just help you expose faster if you can understand the relationships of all three of them and how they work in the triangle. So the first thing we're going to do is I've filled the frame with digital calibration target, and we were using the light meter at the bottom. And right now you can see that center tick mark is right at the center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the aperture. So I'm going to go one click, and see I'm going up in the aperture, which means that it's getting darker. F9, F10, and then boom, that's the last click. So I did 3 clicks. Each one is one third of a stop. So if I go 3, that means I've done a full stop. Let's go the opposite direction. 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3. So every time I've moved the aperture 3 times, I've done 1 stop of light, basically. So let's go back and bring it back to the center. Now, how does that relate to ISO? So if I press the ISO button and I go 1, 2, 3, press the ISO button again, and then press the shutter halfway down, and boom, you can see that we are at 1 stop above. And let's do the same thing. Let's go 1, 2, 3. That's back where we were before. 1, 2, 3. Hit the ISO button, hit the shutter halfway down, and boom, we're 1 stop below. So that tracks perfectly as well. Now let's do it again. Let's reset this 1, 2, 3. And then what I want to do here is I want to do the shutter speed. So on the main dial, we're going to go 1, 2, 3. So I've increased the shutter speed and it got darker. And it went down 1 stop exactly. And 1, 2, 3. We're back to where we were before. And we go 1, 2. Well, we can't go 3 because there's no like 20th of a second or something like that. We can't go there. So you can see it went up exactly 2/3 of a stop, which is exactly what it does. And since we normally shoot at 50th of a second, we're pretty much right there. So that relationship is really important, because sometimes you're going to be saying, I need another stop of light. How do I get it? And like in this situation right here, I'm at 50th of a second, F8, and an ISO of 3200. So if I've got plenty of light, which I do, and the reason I'm at 3200 was just for this demonstration purpose where I could go up and down. I'm in a certain situation where, I don't need F8. I could go lower. I could use, create more shallow depth of field. So in this situation where I know I want to bring the ISO down, let's say 1 stop exactly, I'll hit the ISO button. I'll go 1, 2, 3, hit the ISO button again. I don't even have to look at the meter, and I can take the aperture and I can go 1, 2, 3. And I don't even see the meter right now, and I can press the shutter halfway down, button down, and I know, boom, it's right there, right at the middle. So this is a great demonstration of, like, I'm probably a stop too bright on my ISO. I don't need that much. I don't need that much noise in my image, and I could go down to a 5.6 because the person I'm interviewing, let's say, I know they're not going to move around too much. I don't need F8. Boom, I've just done that. I didn't even have to look at the meter, and I've gotten exactly at the same exact place as where I was before, but with less noise. All right, for our last tool is probably one of the ones that could trump all the other ones if you're questioning whether the meter is working or the histogram. And that basically is just using your eyes on the display at 5x and 10x. So again, we have our lovely doll here again. So before I even zoom in, I'm looking at the histogram. The histogram's not telling us much, and I'm going to change the lighting here to be about more drastic here in a second. This is pretty easy lighting. And so what I'm going to do is just before I even zoom in, I'm just going to play around with the aperture. That to me looks a little too dark. That looks about right. And that looks a little too bright. And so when I zoom in, let's see if we see the same type of thing. That looks, actually it doesn't look too bad between that and that. I'd almost say 5 looks pretty good. F5. But if I go the other direction, that to me looks way too dark. And just using my eye from looking at the doll to about F5, that actually looks right. So I'm just using my eye and I'm looking at the screen. So I'm going back and forth at 10x. So I zoom back out. Again, the histogram's not really telling us much here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the lighting situation to be a little bit more drastic. All right, now we've changed the lighting, and basically all I did was just open my blinds up about 8 inches, and it let in a lot of side or kind of backlight on her. So basically if we zoom in, and we're still at 5.6, and one of the things I do, you can see that the lighting has definitely changed. We got more light along her jawline. And if she had actual, pores on her plasticky skin, we can actually see, we would be able to see detail there. And when I kind of zoom, let's zoom in 5x, and I just kind of look at her and I look at the screen, and I'm going to say maybe the screen looks a little bright, so I'm going to bring it to a 6.3, but now it looks a little dark. So the right exposure without using any sort of digital calibration target is somewhere in between 5.6 and 6.3. And since we have another problem here, and that's her hair, I'm going to leave it at 6.3 for right now. If we zoom in on her hair, we can see we're losing detail in it. So if I go to, let's say, F8, and now you can see a lot of detail in the hair, but if we're back here at like 6.3, we're losing a little bit, not too bad. You could probably bring that back in post. And probably what I would do with this image is I would probably leave it at 6.3. Oh, maybe I go to 7.1. And if we back out, maybe now her face is just a little too dark. And again, you're looking at the histogram. Our histogram is not helping us much here at all. And we don't have a gray card. So what I would probably do in this instance is bring it into your nonlinear, do your editing, and then when you go to color it, you can use programs like DaVinci Resolve Light, which is totally free. You could use Adobe SpeedGrade if you're using Premiere Pro. And then what you could do is, try to correct for the highlights in the hair as much as you can. And then if the face is too dark, you can create a mask around her. So everywhere she moves her face, let's say if this is an actual live person, anywhere she moves, you could track just her face, let's say, feather it out quite a bit, and then bring up the brightness on her face, and you'll get some pretty good results that way too. And that's kind of an advanced topic, but like I said, there's a lot of compromises going on, and if I'm setting exposure, I'm kind of thinking in my mind what I'll be doing in post if I want to get it just perfect. And again, we can't get all the information into the 5D Mark III. It doesn't have like 20 stops of light. It has maybe 10 or 11 stops of light that it can actually record. So that's pretty much it for exposure. Just to review, we've got the meter, the light meter that you see on the bottom. That one works really well, like let's say you're outside in landscapes. I would trust it in that situation. We have a wide lens, it's got the sky, some clouds, you got the foreground objects. A lot of times it's going to get it really well in an outdoor situation where maybe the sun is behind you. You could pretty much trust the meter there. The next one is your histogram. Histogram is great when you have like maybe a more of a close-up of a person and you've got some light coming in from the side, let's say a window, and it's throwing the meter way off. And in that case, you can look at using like a gray card, and you can hold it up and say, yeah, there's 18% gray, I'm going to set it for that. And that type of situation works great. And then in the situations where
the histogram is running up almost close to clipping in the highlights, that's when you can use your next tool, which is the blinkies, and see if where in the image it's clipping. And then the last one is your 5 and your 10x zoom. Just being able to go in and zoom right in on somebody's face or whatever you're trying to get, and really just see if like somebody has oil on their skin, it's got a lot of specular highlights, and it's blowing out, and you can either go up to the person and powder them with some powder or makeup, or adjust your exposure accordingly. So I hope all that stuff helps. This is I think is a really important chapter, getting the exposure, just nailing it. If we were shooting raw, you could be a little bit more loose with this, but getting in there and making sure you got it right the first time is very important.